of evidence and the crime scene investigation team. So you have heard in movies and on television, oh, circumstantial evidence, it's no good. That's not necessarily always the case. So we're going to look at the different types that are available, what they mean, and how they are used. The first thing we need to talk about is why we collect evidence and the job of a CSI. Essentially, the entire goal of a CSI, or a crime scene investigator, is to recognize, collect, document the crime scene. They want to find all of the evidence that's there, they want to collect it, they want to process it, and have it for use in the resolution of the crime. You don't necessarily know when you're in the crime scene what is good evidence and what is not. So the habit is to collect everything that you might think might possibly be involved and to document the entire crime scene. Then later, the investigator themselves, not the CSI, so this will be like the police officer that's investigating the crime, he will piece all of that evidence together to try to figure out exactly what happened. Before we get into the actual evidence, we need to understand a process called Lockhart's exchange principle. So this was developed by Dr. Edmund Lockhart, and basically he said that when any two things come in contact with each other, there is transfer from one person or one object to another. The longer this contact is, or the more intense, the more evidence is going to get transferred from one person or one object to another. So here's a prime example. If I walk down the hall and I accidentally bump into somebody, just kind of brush shoulders, that is a contact, and there's going to be transfer from my shoulder to the person that I bumped into. It's not very intensive, it's not very long, and we're just going to be on our way. Low level of transfer. If, say, there are two people who get into a massive fist fight wrestling match, there's greater intensity of the contact and a lot more lengthy contact, so it's going to result in more transfer of evidence. These little bits of evidence that are transferred in these random occurrences and contacts leave behind a story of that person's day, where they were, who they came in contact with. Did they come in contact with someone who had an animal or someone that had a particular kind of pollen particle on them, what have you. This can provide a very good snapshot of their day, and it can connect them to a perpetrator later to help resolve a crime. Okay, so now that we've covered that, let's go into the evidence. First kind of evidence we're going to talk about is direct evidence. And direct evidence is referring to first-hand observations. So this is going to be, I saw the following thing happen, or it will be a confession, or it can be a video or a photograph or an audio recording of somebody or something going on. So direct evidence are first-hand observations. This is going to be an eyewitness account, video recordings, written confessions, things of that nature. The question that we need to ask ourselves when we're referring to direct evidence, because the majority of it is going to be eyewitness accounts, are, do we believe in that person's testimony enough to make a conviction in a criminal case? And this is something that you actually have to kind of think about. Am I absolutely positive that I saw what I think I saw? Are you willing to be convicted on a single person's statement that they saw you do something? We all know from our observations, activities, that eyewitnesses are not the most reliable sources of evidence. And unfortunately, in the past, a lot of people were convicted based solely on eyewitness accounts, and that has been determined to not be very good, and there's a lot of innocent people that went to jail because of eyewitnesses' accounts. So the reality is nowadays that eyewitness accounts aren't as heavily used because we have all of the other types of evidence that's available to us. And you want to have more than one piece of evidence to convict somebody. It's just a kind of a shoddy case if you just base it on one person's eyewitness account. When we look at eyewitness accounts, we have to keep in mind that many of the eyewitness accounts are going to be the victims. It's going to be what they experienced and saw during the during the crime. And in some cases, the victim is actually going to have a better amount of detail, especially if it was extremely violent, lengthy crime, than somebody who just saw, something happen very quickly, like the 5-second grocery store robbery one that we looked at last week. The big thing to remember is that eyewitness accounts are going to vary considerably from one person to another. If you are a very skilled observer, you might pick up on a lot more details. If you are not, or you're distracted, or you're not feeling well, any number of things could cause you to miss very critical details that might actually end up providing inaccurate information. We were shown in our activities last week that eyewitnesses are just not very reliable. And unfortunately, as I just said, they have led to the wrongful conviction of many, many people before the scientific forensic advancements that have happened in the more recent years. There are still people that go to jail based on eyewitness accounts that are being wrongfully convicted. There is a group called the Innocence Project, which we'll look at throughout the year. Their entire goal is to help free people who are wrongfully convicted. And of the 87% of the people that they have helped to free, they were all convicted of, 87% of them were convicted based on faulty eyewitness testimony. Okay, the next type of evidence we're going to talk about is called circumstantial evidence. And I know on TV and in movies you always hear, oh, it was just circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is everything that is not direct. So it's considered an indirect evidence, and what it does is it implies a fact, but it doesn't necessarily prove it. So this is going to be anything that isn't an eyewitness testimony or a video recording or a written confession. So all the other types of evidence. There are subcategories in circumstantial evidence, either physical or biological, and then it goes beyond that. So finding a suspect's gun, that is considered circumstantial evidence, and because we found that suspect's gun, that provides a link between the suspect and the weapon that was used in the crime. And there's one link, and the goal of collecting evidence is to create lots and lots of links between our suspect and the crime to help basically prove a case as much as you can that that person was the person who committed the crime. So in this next slide, I'm going to show you a little tree of evidence. So we have evidence, and it breaks down into two categories, direct and circumstantial, which we've already talked about. And then circumstantial breaks down into physical and biological. One piece of evidence can be more than one category. So a biological piece of evidence is also considered circumstantial. And we'll look at some examples here. So physical evidence is essentially anything that was not part of a living thing. Okay, it doesn't have DNA in it. It never had DNA in it. So synthetic fibers, that would be artificial man-made clothing, weapons, bullets, shell casings, any types of documents, impressions and shoe prints, tool marks, soil, drugs. Let's see, I said weapons already. Clothing that wasn't made out of natural fibers, car, paint transfer, dirt. So many different things fall into the physical evidence of circumstantial nature. The next kind we have is biological, and this basically means it contains DNA. So any part of the human body that has DNA in it. And there are some caveats here. So body tissues, so skin, bones, blood, organs, all of those fluids, they all have DNA in them, so they're all considered biological evidence. Parts of plants, the cells had DNA in them. Hair, and here's one of the caveats. The only part of the hair that has DNA in it is the root or the follicle that's actually attached to your scalp. So if you pull your hair and cut it, and the hair that falls off, that hair doesn't have DNA. So when you go to the barber shop and you get your hair cut, all the hair that's on the floor doesn't have your DNA in it, so that can't be tied back to you. Only hair that has the root is going to have your DNA in it. Other natural fibers like cotton and wool are going to have DNA in it, wood will, as well as feathers. So these are all biological types of evidence. So trace evidence is referring to very, very small or microscopic evidence, but there's enough there that it can be seen. So a single strand of hair would be considered trace evidence. A little bit of DNA, so say like some bodily fluids that were left behind, a drop or two of blood, pollen, gunshot residue, which is very, very fine, has to be collected off of the skin or clothing. Those are some examples of trace, as well as things like small amounts of dirt and scrapings underneath the fingernails in a violent crime when someone was in a fight. Those would all be called trace. And again, that's just referring to it being very, very small. Now, below our biological and physical evidence, there are two more subcategories, and those are called class and individual. So class evidence is evidence that's going to narrow down to a group of people. So blood type is a good example of class evidence. There are 4 blood groups, A, B, and O. And if you find a couple of criminals, or a couple of suspects rather, and you suspect that they're the perpetrator, but one of them left blood behind at a crime scene, and you tested as type A blood, you know that you now have a group of suspects. They have to have type A blood. So if you suspect somebody and you test their blood and they don't have A type blood, well, then you know you don't have the right person. Hair color, eye color, skin color, gender, weight, height, shoe size. All of these are examples of class evidence, and it doesn't have to be a physical characteristic. So it could be a specific type of weapon, a specific size or caliber of bullet, a serrated blade versus a smooth edge blade, a specific type of car. All of those are classes. So it's just going to narrow it down to a larger group of people or individuals or types of evidence, examples of evidence that will help you eliminate some suspects into a smaller group that you can then work from there. Individual evidence, this is going to narrow it down to a single person. So fingerprints, there's been only one case in forensic history that I'm aware of where someone has been mistakenly identified based on fingerprints, and after more careful analysis, they determined that they had made an error. So fingerprints are totally unique. DNA, again, with the exception of twins, is going to be totally unique. Handwriting generally tends to be unique, and a couple of other physical matches. But individual evidence, most of the time, we're going to be talking about fingerprints and DNA. That limits it down to a single person. One of the examples we can talk about where class becomes individual is your shoes. So when you buy a brand new shoe, and we'll say, you all have Sperry's, they all look the same when you buy them out of the box. And then you wear them, and you wear them for, 2 years or whatever. The wear pattern on the bottom of your shoe is going to be unique to you and how you walk. At that point in time, that shoe has gone from class evidence when it was nice and brand new to individual evidence after it has been worn by you. Next up, we just have a couple pictures of some different types of evidence. What we've got over here is hair. These are microscopic hairs. We've got paint chips. We've got broken glass chips. Over here, we have some fibers. These are natural and synthetic, a combination. Dirt, believe it or not, dirt can be very, very telling. It can create a pattern of where somebody has been based on the analysis of it. And then right here, it's hard to see, but there's actually a footprint right here. So that would be a foot impression that's being measured by this scale. So these are just a couple of examples of some of the some of the circumstantial evidence that could be found at a crime scene. As I mentioned before, evidence can sometimes fall into more than one category. So you have to start at like the top of the tree and work your way down. Is it direct or circumstantial? So let's look at a fingerprint. A fingerprint we know is not direct because it's not an observation. It's actually not an observation, so it's going to be circumstantial evidence. Then we ask, is it physical or biological? Fingerprints themselves don't have DNA in them, so they're going to be considered a physical piece of evidence. And then ask, is it a class or an individual? Well, we know fingerprints are unique to each individual, so it would be an individual example of evidence. So the importance of evidence, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to help make connections between the criminal and the suspect and the crime scene. And the more connections that you have, the more likely you are to be able to prove that individual is guilty of a crime. We're also going to use evidence to help back up or even disprove witness testimony. We're going to link the suspect to the crime or the criminal, to the victim or the crime scene. We can use evidence to help determine the identity of people associated with the crime. This would be the suspect. This could also be a victim. If we have, unfortunately, a deceased individual with no identification, we can use evidence like their fingerprints and their DNA and their dental records to help identify them. The use of evidence forming those connections can tell a story, and it can allow us to help reconstruct the crime so we know what happened. And then again, the more evidence there is, the greater the weight is. It's harder to dispute. So let's look at a couple pieces of evidence here, and you tell me whether you think they could be individual evidence. So we have a matchbook right here with a couple of torn out matches. Is this individual evidence? All of this evidence is considered circumstantial. Let's go with that. But is the matchbook individual evidence? Is the tape that's been torn considered individual evidence? How about the shoe print? The torn piece of paper, the broken glass, and the green fibers. So the matchbook, if you look right here, it's been torn out. That's unique. It's not going to look exactly like any other match that's been torn out, and it can be matched up to this matchbook. That's individual evidence. If we look at the tape right here, and this one, it's kind of hard to tell, but if this tape has been cut, not necessarily, but definitely if it's been torn, because the pattern along the edge here is going to be unique to any other piece of tape. And we could say we found this tape swatch on a body that had been dumped, we could match this tape swatch up to the edge of this tape left at the suspect's home. This could be individual evidence. The shoe print could go either way. It's going to depend upon how unique the wear pattern is. So that one's kind of a grayer area. We know that this cut right here, or these tears all along here, they're all going to be unique to that piece of paper. So this would be another example of individual evidence. Clearly the broken glass, it's never going to break, or the broken bottle, it's never going to break the same twice. So this one's going to have unique fracture patterns, and it's going to be individual evidence. And I can't really tell where these fibers came from off of this article of cloth. If they were cut, we might be able to match them up, but chances are we'd have too hard of a time. So that one kind of be another gray area. So now that we've talked about the types of evidence, direct, circumstantial, physical, biological, class, and individual, let's go on to the crime scene team themselves. The scene is So the crime scene investigation team is going to be the people that are involved in the actual crime scene processing. So the first person that's going to be there is going to be the police officer, our first responding officer. There will be also backup policemen, possibly the district attorney. If there's someone who has been injured, medical professionals could be there, ambulance drivers and medics. Then the investigator or detective will eventually come out. And if somebody has died, the medical examiner or coroner, it's the same name, will come out. And then you're also going to have your CSIs and your photography experts. And then finally, your lab experts who will process the evidence once it arrives back at the lab. So our police officers, as I said, they're going to be the first ones to arrive. Their job is to secure the scene and call out for backup and medical aid for anybody that might be injured, and then they're going to log all of the visitors. So they're the ones that put up that cool no trespassing, or crime scene tape, don't cross, and they do crowd control and keep any of the witnesses there and separated. Our crime scene investigators, or our CSIs, that's what you guys are going to be playing all year. They're the ones that are going to come in and document the detail and collect all the evidence. So their jobs are to sketch the scene. Yes, they actually do a drawing and draw all the things that are in the scene and all the evidence. They take pictures of the scene and pictures of the evidence. They're going to search for the evidence. They're going to collect the evidence. And then, unlike the TV shows, they're not going to analyze that evidence. They're going to take the evidence back to the lab and they're going to distribute it to the appropriate people who are going to then do the analysis based on their expertise. Again, unlike TV shows, one person does not test ballistics and do blood spatter and look at fibers under the microscope and arrest people and interview people. No, those jobs go to different individuals based on their specialty. If somebody has died, a medical examiner or a coroner is going to come out. These are actual medical doctors, and no one else will mess with the body until the medical examiner has arrived. At that point in time, the medical examiner is going to declare, yes, the person is dead. They'll do a preliminary analysis of the scene, take some temperatures, bag the body based on the situation. They might put paper bags over the hands before they put the body into the body bag before it's transported. That protects any evidence that might actually be on the hands. And then they're going to take the body back to the ME's office and do their processing to determine the cause of death. And there are only 5 manners of death, which we'll talk about when we hit the death unit way down the road. And then there's going to be the detectives. Their jobs are to interview witnesses. They're going to talk to the CSI. They're going to talk to the forensic scientists that are working back in the lab who have analyzed the data. And then finally, we'll have some specialists. And these are going to be people who have a very unique specialty, and they're going to be called in based on the type of crime. So one example would be an entomologist. This is somebody who studies insects. Because insects have a very predictable and known life cycle, they can use that information to help determine the time of death. We might also call in, say, a forensic psychologist or a forensic podiatrist. That's somebody who specializes in feet. If there's footprints or what have you, they'll call in the specialist based on their needs for the particular crime that we've been involved in. All right, guys, that wraps up today's lesson. Please know that this material will always be available for you on Edpuzzle whenever you might need it. Have a great night, and I'll see you in class next time.